Right now, today, thousands of people are jogging, picnicking, and walking their dogs across a patch of grass in Central Park, and almost none of them know they're standing on top of a buried town. Before that lawn existed, this was Seneca Village, once the largest community of black landowners anywhere in New York City. 3 churches stood here. A school stood here. Around 50 homes stood here. People spent 30 years of their lives building this place, board by board, brick by brick. Then, in 1857, the city took the land by force, tore every building down, and laid a park over the top of it. That happened more than 150 years ago, and for most of that time, the story almost disappeared completely. Then a machine rolled across those lawns, sending signals down into the earth. And what it found made a team of scientists go completely silent. We're going to come back to that machine and to a second discovery it made, one the researchers were very hesitant to say out loud. But before we get to that part, you need to actually see this place the way it really was. Because nearly everything most people have ever heard about it was shaped to make sure nobody looked too closely. That is exactly why stories like this matter. The ones somebody, at some point, decided you were never really meant to hear. Stay with me through this one, because once you know what is actually sitting a few feet under those lawns, you will never look at this section of the park the same way again. Walk into the west side of Central Park today, somewhere around 82nd to 89th Street, just past the stone wall running along the avenue, and you will find soft rolling lawns, a few quiet paths, some old trees, people out walking dogs and pushing strollers. It looks like it has always been exactly this. Peaceful green space sitting in the middle of Manhattan, like a gift of nature left untouched in the heart of the city. But it was never untouched. It was never natural. And it was never empty. For 32 years, from 1825 until 1857, that exact patch of ground was a living, breathing community. History has come to call it Seneca Village, although we don't know for certain that the people who actually lived there used that name themselves. To really understand why this place mattered so much, you have to remember what New York City was like for a black person in that era. Slavery was still legal in New York State until 1827. Even after it ended, a free black man or woman living downtown in Manhattan was boxed in on every side. Many were crowded into neighborhoods like 5 Points, some of the roughest, most overcrowded slums in the entire country. They faced discrimination in every direction, in the jobs they were allowed to take, in the housing they were allowed to rent, even in simply walking down certain streets without being harassed. The city was not designed to help people like them get ahead. It was designed to keep them boxed in. Then, in the fall of 1825, a white farmer named John Whitehead began quietly selling off small lots of his land far uptown. It was rocky, hilly, considered undesirable at the time, and honestly, that was exactly the point. It was cheap, and it was far away from the people determined to keep black New Yorkers in their place downtown. The very first person to buy a piece of that land was a 25-year-old man named Andrew Williams, who worked shining shoes and driving a cart for a living. On September 27, 1825, he purchased 3 lots outright. That same day, a man named Epiphany Davis, a store clerk who also served as a trustee of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, bought 12 lots. The church itself bought 6 more, and just like that, a community was born. Stop and think about what these people were actually doing. They weren't squatting on land nobody wanted. They weren't drifting from place to place with nowhere else to go. They were buying real property, with real money, with actual deeds and titles attached to their names at a time when most of this country still legally treated black people as property themselves. Every single lot purchased was a quiet act of defiance. Every home built on that land was a statement, whether spoken out loud or not, that said we are here, we belong, and we are not leaving. By the 1850s, Seneca Village had grown into something genuinely remarkable. Around 300 people called it home. Roughly 2 out of every 3 residents were black, and they lived right alongside Irish and German immigrant families, sharing streets and churches in a way that was almost unheard of anywhere else in the country at that time, without the constant friction the rest of the city seemed built around. There were 3 churches, there was a school, there were gardens, livestock, and real solid houses, some of them a full 3 stories tall. Here's the one fact that tells you exactly what Seneca Village actually was. In 1855, out of New York City's entire black population, roughly 12,000 people, only about 100 black men in the whole city owned enough property to legally qualify to vote. At the time, the law required a black man to own $250 worth of real estate before he could cast a ballot. Out of that entire city, out of those roughly 100 men who cleared the bar, 10 of them lived in Seneca Village. Sit with that number for a second. 1 out of every 10 black voters in the entire city of New York lived in this one small community made up of only a few hundred people. This was not some rundown slum on the edge of town. This was the single largest concentration of black political power anywhere in the city. A place where simply owning your home also meant owning your voice. Let me tell you about one specific family, so none of this stays abstract. William Godfrey Wilson served as the sexton, essentially the caretaker, of the All Angels Episcopal Church, right there in the village. His wife was named Charlotte, and she had most likely grown up in Seneca Village herself, since her own mother had owned land there. William and Charlotte raised 9 children together, and William built them a full 3-story wood frame house with a real stone foundation underneath it, a brick chimney, and a metal roof designed to keep out both fire and rain. All 9 of their children attended school. They learned to read and write at a time when that alone was considered a radical, almost dangerous act for a black family to accomplish. Picture that house on an ordinary evening. 9 children under one roof. A father with steady, respected work at the church right next door, close enough to walk home for supper every night. A mother whose own mother had owned that very same ground before her, meaning the family's roots ran 2 full generations deep into that soil. Wood smoke drifting from the chimney, lamplight glowing in the windows of a house their father built with his own 2 hands, 3 full stories meant to stand long after he was gone and pass down to those 9 children after him. That was not some flimsy shack. That was not a squatter's lean-to thrown together overnight. That was a family doing exactly what this country claims it wants every family to do. Work hard, buy land, build a real home, raise children who can read, worship freely, and vote. The Wilson family did every single piece of that, in a country that had barely finished legally treating people who looked like them as property. And that is precisely what stood on the exact ground where joggers now stretch their legs before a morning run, completely unaware of the family that once called that same soil home. Then the city decided it wanted a park. By the 1850s, New York was booming, crowded, and bursting at the seams, and the wealthy and powerful men running the city decided it needed one grand central park, something that could rival the great parks of London and Paris. They chose an enormous stretch of Manhattan, more than 700 acres running straight up the middle of the island, and Seneca Village sat right inside the borders they drew on the map. To actually take the land, the city relied on a legal tool called eminent domain, the government's power to seize private property for public use, as long as it technically pays the owner something in return. On paper, that sounds reasonably fair. In practice, for the people of Seneca Village, it was anything but. The residents fought back the only way they legally could. They filed petitions. They argued, correctly, that their land was being valued at a small fraction of what it was actually worth, that they were being handed pennies for homes and churches and a school they had spent 30 years of their lives building by hand. Landowners across the entire planned park area raised similar complaints. But for the people of Seneca Village specifically, there was an added, deeper cruelty buried inside all of it. For a black man in that era, losing that property didn't just mean losing a house. It meant losing the $250 of real estate that legally gave him the right to vote in the first place. The city wasn't only taking their homes, it was quietly taking their political voice right along with them. And to make that entire process go down easier, the newspapers of the day went to work. This next part should sound uncomfortably familiar because it is a pattern that has been repeated against black communities again and again throughout American history. Before you remove a group of people from land they legally own, you first convince the public that they were never worth keeping around in the first place. The press of that era described Seneca Village as a shanty town. They labeled the residents squatters and vagabonds. One newspaper actually sneered that police were having a hard time convincing these simple-minded people to leave, as if they were children rather than property owners with legal deeds in hand. Reporters took a thriving, land-owning, church-building, school-running community and repainted it as a nest of nuisances the city would be doing everyone a favor by clearing away. It was a lie, but it was an extremely useful lie, and it worked exactly as intended. By the end of 1857, it was over. Roughly 1,600 people were displaced across the entire footprint of what would become the park. The residents of Seneca Village were forced out. Their homes were torn down board by board. Their churches were pulled apart piece by piece. Their school was gone completely. Picture the Wilson family standing there in that exact moment. William watching the very church he had cared for taken apart in front of him. Charlotte, whose own mother had owned that ground, watching 2 full generations of family roots get pulled straight out of the earth in a single season. 9 children standing among the wreckage of the only home any of them had ever known, watching the 3-story house their father built with his own hands get reduced first to a pile of stone and then eventually to nothing at all. Where could a family like that even go afterward? Back down into the same crowded, overcrowded downtown neighborhoods they had originally worked so hard to climb out of. Back to renting instead of owning. Back to being boxed in all over again. Forced to start completely over with only a fraction of what their land had actually been worth. The gardens those 9 children had once played in were flattened. The ground itself was reshaped, regraded, and planted over so thoroughly that eventually there was no visible sign anyone had ever lived there, worshipped there, voted from there, or raised an entire family on that soil. And here's the cruelest part of the whole story. It worked so well that the village was nearly wiped from history entirely. For well over 100 years, most New Yorkers had absolutely no idea Seneca Village had ever existed at all. People strolling through that particular section of the park had no idea whatsoever that they were walking directly over the foundations of black-owned homes. The story was buried just as thoroughly as the actual stones were. It survived only in a small handful of old records, a few faded maps, and the memories of descendants who were rarely, if ever, asked to share what they knew. For more than a century, Seneca Village existed as little more than a ghost. And then science went looking for it. Because you obviously cannot just start digging up Central Park on a whim. It is one of the most protected, most heavily visited pieces of land anywhere in the world. You cannot roll bulldozers in and tear open the lawns based on a hunch, no matter how promising that hunch might be. The researchers trying to locate Seneca Village faced a genuinely difficult problem. How exactly do you excavate a site you are not legally permitted to disturb? The answer they landed on was to look without digging at all. In the years leading up to 2011, a team made up of archaeologists and historians turned to a technology called ground-penetrating radar. If you've never seen this kind of equipment work, the concept is fairly simple and honestly a little eerie to watch. You push a device that looks a lot like a lawnmower slowly back and forth across the grass. It sends pulses of radar energy straight down into the earth and then listens carefully for the echoes bouncing back up. Solid, undisturbed soil sends back one kind of signal. Buried stone, old building foundations. Disturbed earth, a filled-in cellar. All of these bounce the radar signal back in noticeably different ways. The machine essentially draws a picture of everything sitting underground, without disturbing a single blade of grass on the surface. The team rolled that radar equipment back and forth across the quiet lawns near 85th Street. Slow and patient, working line by line, almost exactly the way you would methodically mow a field. Around them, it was just an ordinary afternoon in the park. People walking past, dogs running around, hardly anyone paying much attention to this small team and their unusual-looking machine. And then the ground answered back. Beneath that carefully manicured grass, the radar echoes returned sharp and unmistakable in the clear shapes of walls. Straight lines, right angles, the unmistakable geometry of human construction, of foundations laid down by human hands, sitting exactly where the old historical maps said the village should be. Not vague, random shapes either, but the clean, deliberate corners of actual rooms, the outlines of entire buildings. Try to picture standing there yourself, watching the shape of a vanished house slowly rise up on a screen, directly beneath a lawn where, at that very moment, some child nearby is flying a kite, completely unaware. The lawns were never actually empty. They never had been. Just a few feet below that manicured surface, the bones of Seneca Village were still sitting there, exactly where the city had once tried to make them vanish forever, quietly waiting for somebody to finally come looking again. And the radar picked up something else buried in that ground too, something that made the researchers go quiet, right around the area near the old churches. The radar signal returned shapes that appeared consistent with graves. Seneca Village did have its own cemeteries, since its churches buried their dead there, exactly as churches everywhere have always done. When the city cleared the village to build the park, it did relocate some of the known burial grounds. But the radar data suggested that not everything, and possibly not everyone, had necessarily been moved along with them. This is the part where the researchers went quiet, and where being honest requires real care, because I am not going to tell you more than the actual evidence can support. Radar alone cannot confirm with total certainty that human remains are still sitting down there. It can only reveal shapes that are consistent with what graves typically look like underground. The only way to know for absolute certain would be to actually dig, and digging in a location like that is something no responsible research team ever does lightly, especially given the city's own strict preservation rules discouraging exactly that kind of excavation. So the truth of it sits there, unresolved, and honestly, pretty heavy to think about. It remains entirely possible that beneath the picnic blankets and sunbathers today, some of the people of Seneca Village are still lying in that same ground where their own families originally laid them to rest, unmarked, never moved, and until fairly recently, essentially unremembered by anyone at all. In 2011, after years of persistent requests, the research team was finally granted permission to carry out a careful, tightly limited excavation, under very strict conditions. Fill every test hole back in completely at the end of each single day. Remove every piece of equipment from the site by nightfall without exception. And within those small, deliberately respectful digs, they finally found it, the exact thing the radar had promised them was there. They uncovered the actual stone foundation of William Godfrey Wilson's house. The real, physical foundation of the real home where that church sexton and his wife had raised all 9 of their children. It had genuinely been there this entire time. From the soil, they carefully pulled out hundreds of individual artifacts, a bone toothbrush handle, the leather sole of a child's shoe, a broken fragment of a teapot, an old iron kettle, the small, ordinary objects that make up a family's everyday life, including that leather child's shoe sole, sitting quietly in the dirt for more than 150 years, just a few feet beneath the feet of joggers who had absolutely no idea what they were running over. Think about what that single small shoe actually represents. A real child once wore it. A child who lived in an actual house, inside an actual community, whose father owned enough land to vote, whose family was clearly building something meant to last for generations. And all of it was labeled a slum, torn down completely, paved over, and quietly forgotten, so the city could have a nice lawn instead. So what does a story like this actually tell us in the end? It tells us that the erasure of Seneca Village wasn't some accidental footnote of history. It was a deliberate decision. A decision to value a park over actual people. A decision to believe a convenient lie printed in a newspaper over the very plain, physical evidence of real homes, real churches, and a real school. And it was a decision repeated over and over again in every generation that followed, simply choosing not to mention it, letting the story quietly fade, letting the grass grow thick over it until it disappeared almost entirely from public memory. And here is the part that should probably stay with you the longest. Seneca Village was not some rare, isolated event in American history. It happened early, but it was never rare. What took place on that exact patch of ground happened again and again across this entire country for the next 100 years and beyond. You've probably heard some of these other names before. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, an entire thriving district of black-owned prosperity, burned to the ground and cleared away in 1921. Africa Town in Alabama, founded by the very last people ever brought to this country aboard a slave ship, its air and land slowly surrounded and polluted by heavy industry over the decades that followed. Bruce's Beach in California, once a thriving black-owned seaside resort, seized by a local government and not returned to the original family for roughly 100 years afterward. And well beyond just those well-known names, there are dozens upon dozens of ordinary everyday black neighborhoods that were quietly bulldozed throughout the 20th century to make way for new highways, and for what city planners politely called urban renewal at the time, a phrase so many of the families who actually lived through it came to know by a very different name entirely. The pattern really is always the same, every single time. Black families do exactly everything they're told to do. They buy the land. They build genuine homes. They follow every single rule laid out in front of them. And it still gets taken away and paved over regardless. And then, to finish the job completely, those same families are blamed for their own removal, labeled squatters, slums, and blight, so the people responsible for taking it can sleep soundly at night without a second thought. Seneca Village was one of the very first times this exact playbook was ever run in America. It was, unfortunately, very far from the last. Once you know to look for it, you start noticing this same story quietly, repeating itself in city after city, decade after decade, almost always following the same 3 steps. Describe the community as something worth removing, remove it under a law that sounds fair on paper, and then let the years slowly do the rest of the work of making everyone forget it was ever there at all. More recently, groups working to preserve the park's full history have started bringing this story back into the light in new ways, offering public tours through the old village site, building detailed 3-dimensional models of what the community likely looked like, and working towards some kind of permanent, visible marker within the park itself, so that this story never has to be buried a second time. That radar equipment rolling quietly across those lawns did far more than simply locate a few old walls underground. It handed the lie back its truth. It proved, beyond reasonable doubt, that underneath the most famous park in the entire country, there is a genuine black town that was deliberately destroyed, told to disappear completely, and that ultimately refused, in the end, to stay disappeared forever. The people of Seneca Village bought their own small piece of the American promise in cash, with proper deeds, fair and square, following every rule the country had set out for them, and the country still took it back anyway, and grew a garden directly on top of it, quietly hoping nobody would ever bother asking what was actually buried underneath. Well, now you know exactly what is underneath.